At 1,407 local time, FA-18 Super Hornets were thundering toward these three irreplaceable Iranian aircraft at Kerman Airport. Overhead, a circling drone was transmitting footage back to the strike group, and what it captured wasn't promising. The Iranians were preparing to get these jets airborne at any moment, and just as the F-18S pushed to full afterburner, an Iranian operator emerged looking to make themselves famous. Both FA-18 pilots' call signs Raven 1 and Raven 2 had swung wide east through Baluchistan to sidestep everything. The desert didn't cooperate. Raven 1's ALR-67, the radar warning receiver that tells a pilot who's targeting you and how aggressively, lit up with a tone every fighter pilot memorizes and never wants to hear. Phased array acquisition at fast pulse repetition. A Tor M1 battery, within 12 kilometers. The battery had been sitting dormant in the foothills with its radar switched off. The missile defense equivalent of a bouncer stationed in a dark corner of a club, arms folded watching the entrance. No small talk, no cautionary glance across the room. The instant the Super Hornets crossed the horizon, it bypassed the search phase entirely and jumped straight to fire control. No, who are you? No, may I see some identification? Just a fist already swinging before you finished walking through the door. Raven 1's hands were already in motion, left to the chaff switch, right tightening on the stick. Think of the incoming missile as a telephone pole doing Mach 2.8 that pulls 28 Gs in the terminal phase, roughly 4 times what the pilot can withstand before losing consciousness. The phased array hops frequencies faster than most jammers can track, like attempting to converse with someone who switches languages mid-syllable. The surviving crews had learned precisely one trick in 11 days of war: fire once, shut down, and flee as fast as possible before the Americans can retaliate. Raven 1 hauled the stick into his lap and pulled 6 Gs. The horizon snapped vertical and the desert floor filled his canopy. Behind him, the AL-47 dispenser cycled chaff, aluminum-coated fibers blooming into a radar decoy the same size as the jet. The ALQ-214 jammer fed false range data into the tracking frequency. It directed the missile toward empty air 500 meters behind the aircraft. Raven 2 broke in the opposite direction, dividing the formation and compelling the battery crew to select one target. They selected Raven 1. The chaff and the jammer's false data corrupted the tracking solution, while 6 Gs of geometrical shift moved the jet cleanly out of the seeker's prediction cone. The warhead detonated behind and below. Shrapnel distance, no direct hit, but close enough to rattle the airframe and ruin your flight suit. Inside the Tor M1, the battery commander slammed the master switch and the scope went dark. The driver was already engaging the tracks beneath them. 2 weeks prior, the commander would have fired again. But 11 days of watching America reduce Iran to rubble gave him second thoughts. But the Tor didn't need a direct hit. It needed 45 seconds. The 6G break threw both jets 12 miles south of the intended route. That placed them out of the empty desert corridor and into the foothills, where an Iranian surveillance radar operator sat in a mountain pass scanning southeast. He had relocated his mobile unit out of Isfahan province ahead of the first week's strikes and established himself in terrain the coalition hadn't prioritized, a move that demanded either exceptional initiative or exceptional paranoia. In Iran's military, the two were frequently indistinguishable. He couldn't shoot anything down. He didn't need to. He grabbed the handset and relayed to Kerman what his scope displayed. 2 fighter returns heading northeast, medium altitude, moving with the kind of urgency that meant someone's day was about to get considerably worse. That phone call, routed through a landline because 11 days of American strikes had reduced Iranian military communications to the world's most expensive game of telephone, reached the IRGC garrison before the Ravens finished reassembling their formation. While the report raced toward the airfield, Raven 2 discovered what 6 Gs had done to his targeting pod. The ATFLIR's gimbal uses fiber optic gyroscopes to hold the infrared image steady, compensating for every movement the aircraft makes at 500 knots. 15 seconds at 6 Gs had knocked those gyroscopes off their reference. The image now jittered across the desert floor like trying to read a street sign through a bus windshield on a gravel road. He cycled the pod to standby. The jitter continued. What Raven 2 didn't know, what nobody would confirm until the maintenance debrief back on the Lincoln, was that the gyroscopes hadn't merely drifted. The 6G snap had microfractured the fiber optic coupler feeding the reference laser. The pod wasn't drifting, it was guessing. Below 15,000 feet, the narrower field of view would compensate, with the target filling enough of the frame that the drift couldn't lose it. But 15,000 feet placed him inside the engagement envelope of every short-range weapon the IRGC still possessed. The Tor hadn't just pushed them off course and into a surveillance radar. It had destroyed Raven 2's targeting capability and was about to force him into the altitude band where ground defenses perform most effectively. At Kerman, a ground controller grabbed a field telephone mid-ring, listened for 4 seconds, and sprinted across the apron. Fighters inbound, fuel trucks lurched away from wheel chocks within seconds. A response time that would have impressed any Air Force on Earth, considering these crews had spent 11 days watching American precision munitions convert everything around them into rubble. Inside the cockpit, the flight engineer was already throwing switches on the overhead panel. APU start sequence. The beginning of the 4 to 5 minute spool that feeds compressed air to each of the 4 Soloviev turbofans at roughly 90 seconds per engine. If every step went smoothly, the IL-76 could be taxiing before the Americans arrived. 8,000 miles away at Creech Air Force Base, a Reaper sensor operator watched the scramble unfold in real time. The operator keyed the satellite link. Activity at the target, engine start on the Heavy. When the Reaper's fuel state crossed bingo 20 hours on station, longer than most people stay awake in a day, the mission wasn't finished, but the fuel was. The sensor operator swept the apron one final time, time-stamped the frame, and turned south toward Djibouti. The screen went to empty desert. The replacement Reaper was 30 minutes out. The Ravens were 25. For the next 5 minutes, nobody on the American side could observe Kerman Airfield. The Ravens circled while fuel burned, and the IL-76 crew raced through their checklist with nobody watching. But here's what the Americans couldn't see during those 5 blind minutes. The IL-76 wasn't merely spooling engines to evacuate. Ground crews were loading crates through the rear cargo ramp, long olive green cases that didn't correspond to any standard supply manifest. Whatever the IRGC was attempting to fly out of Kerman was worth more to them than the aircraft itself. The CAOC at Al Udeid, Combined Air Operations Center, air traffic control for the entire war, kept the Ravens in orbit. No ISR coverage meant no weapons release authorization. Standard procedure that made perfect sense from a headquarters 900 miles away, where the coffee was hot and the ejection seats were theoretical, and made no sense whatsoever from the cockpit of an aircraft burning fuel it couldn't spare. At Kerman, those same 5 minutes provided everything the garrison required. The ground controller had Zu-23 gun trucks rolling from the motor pool before the first orbit was complete. By minute 3, a MISA, 2 manpad team stood on the maintenance hangar roof with a launch tube on the operator's shoulder. The MISA-2 is Iran's copy of the Chinese QW-1, which was itself China's copy of the Russian Igla, which makes the MISA a photocopy of a photocopy. And like any third-generation knockoff, it functions just well enough to ruin your afternoon. The replacement Reaper checked in at 23,000 feet. An MQ-9 with a multispectral targeting system good enough to read a license plate from 4 miles up, operated by a sensor operator in a trailer at Creech Air Force Base, through what amounts to a very expensive Xbox setup with a 600 millisecond satellite delay. The operator slewed the turret to the apron, and the image came in clean. All 3 confirmed. APU hot on the Heavy. Recommend immediate. Hold released. 16 minutes to target. The broken targeting pod and the 5-minute head start, both courtesy of the Tor, M1, were waiting at the other end. Raven 1 swept the airfield from maximum ATF LIR range. The advanced targeting forward-looking infrared pod slung under the jet's belly, essentially a thermal telescope that lets the pilot study a target from far enough away that the people on the ground can't. Retaliate. Lead's pod was clean, stable image, the kind of picture you engineer a targeting system to produce. 2 pickup trucks with ZU-232 twin-barreled anti-aircraft guns sat at opposite ends of the runway, north and south. The ZU-23 fires 23mm rounds at 800 to 1,000 per minute per barrel. No radar, no signature on the RWR, the AK-47 of anti-aircraft guns. The gunner doesn't aim so much as just open fire and hope for the best. 70 meters from the ATF LIR, on the maintenance hangar roof, the manpad operator was clearly visible on the Reaper's infrared feed. Raven 1 could see the tube on his shoulder and the intercept geometry he'd already calculated. Between the ZU-23S saturating the sky and the MISA-2 waiting for engine exhaust, Kerman's defenses formed an equation. Come in high and GPS jamming ruins your bomb. Come in low and the ground defenses ruin your day. The weapons they carried, GBU, 38 JDAMs 500-pound GPS-guided bombs have a circular error probable of 5 meters under ideal conditions. That places the weapon on the fuselage. Under the Chinese-supplied GPS jamming concentrated around Iranian airfields, that circle expands to 25 meters. Against a building, it's still a hit. Against a parked aircraft, it's a crater on the taxiway and a P-3 that limps to another field. The only way to improve accuracy was to release lower, cut the flight time from 90 seconds to 30. Less drift, tighter impact. But lower meant the ZU-23 envelope and the MISA, 2 ceiling. The Tor, M1's 45 seconds still compounding. Raven 1 rolled in first at 12,000 feet. 30-degree dive angle with FLIR locked on the P-3F. 3 seconds from Pickle, the South ZU-23 opened up. No warning tone, just orange-white tracers punching through the air the Super Hornet was about to occupy, while the gunner walked his lead angle across the dive path with the composure of someone who had been doing this for 11 straight days. 1,600 combined rounds per minute. He didn't need to be precise. He just needed to be close. Hard right into afterburner with the release window gone and the bomb still on the pylon. First run scrubbed by a weapon system that costs less than a used sedan. On the rooftop, the manpad operator noted the break. Heading, altitude, the roll angle that told him where the jet would reappear if the pilot attempted the same approach again. 11 days into this war, the Iranians, still fighting, were the ones thinking 2 moves ahead. Raven 2 couldn't afford to wait. The IL-76 had been spooling for 25 minutes with possible engine activity on infrared, the one target that would disappear if they spent another 60 seconds on the ZU-23 problem. Raven 1 climbed back for altitude while his wingman committed on the heavy transport alone. 10,000 feet, 2,000 lower than the lead's aborted run. Pushed into that altitude by a targeting pod, the Tor had broken 40 minutes and 300 miles ago. The crosshairs drifted left past the IL-76's wing route, overcorrected right, settled on the center line for half a second, and he mashed the Pickle during that brief moment of stability. The entire weapon solution riding on a momentary pause from a pod that hadn't functioned correctly since the foothills. The GBU-38 dropped off the pylon with its tail kit deploying. 4 fins snapped into the airstream while the GPS receiver searched for the satellite constellation. The signal it found was already being contested. The jamming didn't arrive like a wall it crept in. Noise flooding the GPS frequency the way static drowns a phone call, with a position solution drifting as interference buried the signal the bomb was navigating by. Fins corrected by a fraction of a degree. The jamming pushed the other way. Fins countered. Every correction was a contest between the satellite signal the guidance could still detect and the interference attempting to bury it. 30 seconds of an invisible exchange through 12,000 feet of contested spectrum. At 8,000 feet, the jamming found a resonance. The position solution jumped sideways by 11 meters. Fins slammed to maximum deflection, overcorrected, then found center again. Not through stillness, but through constant adjustment on every axis. A tightrope walk where the wire never stops moving and someone keeps switching the lights on and off. From the rooftop, the MISA-2 launched. The operator had tracked Raven 2's descent for 15 seconds, waiting for the rear quarter aspect where both F-414 engine nozzles were fully exposed. The jet's missile warning receivers detected the plume at 5 o'clock low. Raven 2 broke into the missile and rotated its hottest aspect away from the seeker. AL-47 dispensers fired MJU-53 flares, magnesium pellets burning at 2,000 degrees. Temporary suns engineered to confuse the same thermal imaging system that made the MISA too lethal. The seeker constructed its picture and faced a choice. The flares burned hotter, but the aircraft presented a larger thermal signature. The system needed 1 second to distinguish the difference. The brake rotated the image faster than the focal plane array could refresh. Image smeared. The missile committed to the nearest flare and detonated 100 meters behind the aircraft. Alive, flight suit probably ruined, and completely blind to his own bomb. The GBU-38 was still descending through the final 4,000 feet. Fins correcting through the Chinese interference with every remaining second of flight time. The Reaper observed the impact from 20,000 feet forward of the wing root, fuselage splitting open, the tail section collapsing sideways. The APU that had been powering an engine start sequence for 25 minutes was now supplying fuel to a fire. The IL-76 crew had raced through their checklist, while the American jets circled overhead, unable to engage. The aircraft would never depart the apron. The manpad brake pushed Raven 2 south, directly across the ZU-23's firing arc at the south end of the runway. The same gun that had aborted Raven 1's run 30 seconds earlier, a weapon the Soviet Union developed in 1960 and Iran acquired for the price of a decent pickup truck. The gunner already had his lead angle from the first engagement. He had observed both passes, calculated the geometry in his head, and was now positioning for a cleaner shot. Both barrels opened up and tracers climbed through the space the jet had occupied half a second before. At this range and closing speed, the gunner was placing rounds inside a volume the size of a house, and the Super Hornet had to thread through the gaps. Raven 2 moved through the stream with small corrections, just enough random motion to make the ballistic prediction wrong by the width of a fuselage. Rounds behind him, more fuel gone from a margin both pilots could count on one hand. Raven 1 came back from the northeast on a completely different line. The first run had shown him where the South ZU-23 was positioned. Raven 2's engagement revealed where the manpad operator was aiming. He positioned the maintenance hangar between his dive line and the rooftop, concrete and steel blocking the operator's line of sight during the 3 seconds that mattered most. ATFLIR, locked on the P-3, 51 years old, Lockheed built in Burbank. Iranian crews had learned to fly it at Moffett Field when the Shah was still in power. The airframe had survived the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war on 23,000 man-hour overhauls with components Lockheed stopped supplying when Carter was president. It had buzzed the USS Essex in 2019, American-built and harassing the Navy that originally operated it. Now it was time to settle the score. Pickle. GBU, 3-8 into the same Chinese jamming. Interference shoved the signal sideways while the fins pushed back through 12,000 feet of contested air. Impact at the wing root. Fuel cells ignited. Half a century of sustaining an aircraft that its manufacturer had discontinued erased by a bomb constructed 15 miles from the factory that built the plane. Hold off for the final target. The North ZU-23 fired as he rolled in. Both barrels, tracers closer this time. The gunner adjusting from 2 previous passes he had observed from the far end of the runway. Raven 1 maneuvered through the stream with the fuel state dropping into amber on his HUD. That number meant the tanker over the Gulf of Oman wasn't optional anymore. It was the difference between landing on the Lincoln and going for an unplanned swim in the Arabian Sea. Every additional second over this airfield was a second he couldn't recover, and he still had one more bomb to place on one more aircraft. The C-130 filled the ATFLIR display, another American airframe Iran had purchased from Lockheed half a century ago. Then he pickled. The tail kit fought through the same jamming and punched through the fuselage amidships. 3 for 3.